Good afternoon, everyone. And you've made it to the last panel of the day, so well done. And we will rally our energy for our lovely panelists today. Our panel today is called Eldritch Islands, the Cthulhu, Mythos, and Japan. And unfortunately, one of our speakers isn't able to be here, but Drew and Michael will be reading his paper for him. So we will at least have the pleasure of his work. So we're going to go out of order a little bit from the listing on the program. Our first speaker is going to be Michael Heyes, whose talk is called Housing Complex C and the Subversion of Lovecraft in Japan. Michael is an associate professor and chair of the religion department at, how do you say your college? Lycoming. At Lycoming College. What a fantastic name for a college. Feels very lycanthropic. His research interests include race and gender in the medieval world, demonology, and monstrosity from the medieval to modernity, and religion and film. His most recent monograph is called Demons in the USA, From the Anti-Spiritualists to QAnon, and that came out in 2024. Our second speaker today is Drew Richardson, whose talk is called Memories of Tentacles, Life and Lovecraft, parentheses, in the Works of Aramata Hiroshi. Drew Richardson got his PhD here at UCSC in history last year, and he's a historian and instructor for Kyu College here at UCSC, where he's also the co-director for curriculum development in the Okinawa Memories Initiative. His research examines media and placemaking practices in native Japanese ethnography, folklore, and monsters. He's held visiting research fellowships in Tokyo at both, I'm going to murder this. How do you say this university? Kokugakuen University and Hosei University. Thank you. And then our final speaker in spirit, if not in body, is Kyu Hyun Kim, whose talk is called The Leech Child and Its Unspeakable Progenies, The Shadow Evolution and Weird Bodies in Morohoshi Daijiro's Graphic Literature. Kyu Hyun Kim was born in Seoul, Korea. He received his PhD in History and East Asian Languages in 1997 from Harvard University. He was a postdoc at the Edwin O. Reiskauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard from 1996 to 1997, served in the Japanese Society for Promotion of Science Fellowship. He was nominated and sponsored in the US by the Japan Advisory Board, Social Science Research Council in 2000, and so we will enjoy him in spirit. So I'll hand things over to Michael.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. Just as a quick heads up too, these are all part of a collection of essays that are going to come out from McFarland next year called Eldritch Islands, Essays on the Cthulhu, Mythos, and Japan, I believe is our final working title. So if you're interested in the content here, you might be interested in the book. Buy two. Very few authors exert the kind of influence that H.P. Lovecraft does on the horror landscape of the United States and beyond. Dying a relatively unknown creator of short fiction in the 1940s, Lovecraft was propelled to relative fame by his influence upon horror creators such as Stephen King and H.R. Giger. He is credited as the creator of cosmic horror, a subgenre which focuses upon the insignificance of humans in the cosmic order. He is perhaps best remembered for the pantheon of alien gods, often referred to as Old Ones, including Cthulhu, a squid dragon hybrid who dwells dead but dreaming below the ocean in his sunken city of R'lyeh, and Yog-Sothoth, an entity made up of orbs or eyes, who is implied to control the totality of space and time, and species of monstrous human-like entities such as the Deep Ones, immortal human fish-toad hybrids who seek to mate with humans. Yummy. Many of Lovecraft's creations bear at least a passing relationship to his racism. It is clearly emergent in his published narratives, such as Facts Concerning the Late Arthur Germain and His Family, The Horror at Red Hook, or Herbert West's Reanimator, and in his private life as well. Scholarship on Lovecraft and his narratives have similarly keyed into this disturbing element of his life and work. Despite this repellent aspect, Lovecraft's impact on media, both in the United States and abroad, is difficult to overstate. One trend in the United States of confronting Lovecraft's bigotry while continuing to produce cosmic horror is by writing from a vantage which incorporates voices otherwise silenced in his works, a literary trend that I address in this presentation as Lovecraftian subversion. Perhaps most famously, Victor Laval retells the horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black man in the Ballad of Black Tom. Laval's retelling centers racial oppression and brutality in the United States, likening the indifference of Lovecraft's old ones to humans as white America is to black. On some level, this is something of an anticipated shift when we consider the United States' relationship with race. That is, the United States is seeking to increase racialism, i.e. making race more salient through social discussions, educational initiatives, and governmental requirements such as the 5 race checkboxes found on many forms, in an effort to decrease racism. That is, by increasing the visibility of race, such initiatives normalize ideas of race as well as make it more difficult to hide racist actions carried out by individuals or organizations. Clearly, the purpose of this approach is to shore up gaps in equality, a central principle of American culture, which is undercut by the continued presence of racism. Given this influence, socio-political imaginary upon the literary imaginary, it seems unlikely that Japan would produce the same trend. The racial imaginary in Japan is a rather complex phenomenon. As William Weatherall notes, unlike in the United States, quote, in Japanese law, Japanese are just Japanese, a raceless nationality, end quote. At the same time, this does not preclude the active or passive perception of race among Japanese people, and Nihon Jinron literature complicates the idea of a raceless nationality by arguing for a distinct sense of Japaneseness, which is transmissible by genotype, that is, Junketsu Shugi. I argue that such a Lovecraftian subversion inflected by Japanese social and political ideas takes place in Yuji Nara's Housing Complex C, or C-Danshi. As the creation of a Japanese director and writer, the work necessarily filters its subversion not through recognizable American ideas of race, but rather through the Japanese political and social imaginary. As a result, the primary conflict is between those who are identifiable as phenotypical Japanese and those who are obviously not. Oops. Wrong screen. That is, outsiders or gaijin. All of this is to point out a gap which exists in the Japanese notion of social harmony, or wa. When people of all kinds fail to get along, social harmony is destroyed, and the framework that supports mankind's survival crumbles. In order to do so, I'll summarize the narrative to highlight the clear Lovecraftian elements. From there, I will discuss some of the racializing interplays between 2 sets of characters, and conclude with the narrative's very un-Lovecraftian appeal to social harmony. Due to time constraints, I won't be able to discuss how the narrative constructs a foil to the idea of being genotypically Japanese. The anime tells the tale of the eponymous building which houses a majority population of elderly phenotypic Japanese people. The seeming outlier in this population is Kimi, a jubilant 9-year-old girl with a happy-go-lucky personality. Kimi is beloved by the elderly residents of the complex and lives a worry-free existence. In the first episode, this relative peace is shattered by the arrival of a group of foreign interns, likely either Pakistani or Middle Eastern, from Tsurie fisheries, led by the Japanese Koshide family. Tensions begin to rise between the group of foreign interns and the Japanese residents as more and more mysterious circumstances take place. Eventually, the majority of the residents of the complex are slain by the Koshide family. Kimi herself escapes this fate because it turns out she is far from an ordinary girl. She is in fact the cosmic entity Yog-Sothoth from H.P. Lovecraft's narratives, who has trapped Kurosaki in a time loop that repeats the year 2000 over and over again. At its core, Housing Complex C is a modification of Lovecraft's narrative of the shadow over Innsmouth. Long ago, the Deep Ones, addressed as South Sea peoples, came to Shirosaki, White Cape, in an effort to have the all-powerful god Yog-Sothoth, here we go, Iyoyoro Kisoyohosu, it's a kind of a tongue twister in Japanese, raise its progeny Cthulhu, did it again, Kuzururu, from the dead. The Deep Ones sacrificed themselves in an effort to appease Yog-Sothoth, sacrifices which eventually stained the peninsula and turned it into Kurosaki, or Black Cape. Yog-Sothoth rejected their requests, and the narrative implies that the people attempted to kill the god and its followers as a result. In the present day of the narrative, the descendants of Cthulhu have returned to Kurosaki. This return is both the literal descendants of Cthulhu in the form of the Deep Ones and the worshippers of Cthulhu in the form of the Koshide family. These descendants are engaging in animal sacrifices which eventually culminate in the human sacrifices of the residents at Housing Complex C. They believe the resurgent power of Yog-Sothoth marks the return of their god, Cthulhu. Kimi's identity as Yog-Sothoth is part of a larger conceit of the story, encapsulated in the title of the first episode, Optical Illusions. Throughout the course of the story, there are several tricks deployed which color the audience's perception of events and characters. The most obvious of these is the childlike nature of Kimi, which directs our attention away from her true nature. Kimi's manipulation of time is another deception. Although the date, the year 2000, is clearly indicated by the calendar on Kimi's wall that we see multiple times, we take the appearance of contemporary cell phones for granted even as Kimi clearly marvels at them. However, these optical illusions also compound through a process referred to in the series as mismatched buttons. Takashi Takamura, the traditional Lovecraftian antiquarian who reveals important narrative elements to the audience, explains that the turn of phrase, quote, means something like this: when you're mistaken on the very first thing, everything else turns out wrong too. That is, once people assume that their misperceptions are in fact the correct way of seeing the world, then they become hopelessly mired in an illusion of their own making, doomed to see the world falsely. It is these illusions and mismatches that fuel the Lovecraftian subversion in the narrative. Every illusion causes the residents of the complex to interpret threatening characters as benevolent and benevolent characters as threatening, often based on preconceived racial assumptions. There are two primary mismatches that occur over the course of the narrative: the mismatch between the Koshide family and the interns, and that between Kanmiya, a member of the interns, and Yuri Koshide, a member of the Koshide family. Due to time constraints, I will only be discussing the first grouping, but happy to answer more in questions. Unbeknownst to us, the Koshide family is not the upright and proper Japanese family, which they appear to be. They are covert worshippers of Cthulhu who are bent on sacrificing the residents of Housing Complex C to their fallen god. Similarly, the interns are often implied to be the worshippers of Cthulhu in the piece, and summarily painted in a threatening or horrific light. In reality, they are simply phenotypical foreigners that are going about their everyday lives as peacefully as they are able. In the first episode, Toshiwada, depicted here, the building manager of the complex, is approached by Seiichi Koshide, who introduces the technical interns he oversees for the fisheries. Wada is clearly upset by the people at her door, and the camera angle switches to her point of view. Koshide is depicted in a low-angle style, typically associated with placing people in positions of power or authority. Conversely, the shot that follows is at eye level to Wada, allowing us to slowly take in the technical interns' faces as the shot pans across them. The audience is clearly meant to grasp that they are not part of the homogenized Japanese ideal. Wada echoes this when she says, they're all foreigners? The leader of the technical interns, Rubel, then greets Wada in a simple yet traditional manner, at which point Wada, twitching with fear, attempts to retreat from the situation. Rubel stops her, offering a simple moving-in gift. Wada again retreats, cutting off Koshide's next statement with a closed door. Wada slides down the closed door and expresses regret that she didn't know foreigners would be coming to the complex. The following day, the seeming trouble around the interns multiplies. Yoshi and Kobayashi, two of Taka's friends, find fish strewn around the yard of the complex. As Wada rounds the corner, we hear strange chanting, similar to a scene of chthonic chanting which opens the first episode. Wada says to herself, "What's with those evil sounds?" as eerie background music can be heard. Wada then bursts into one of the interns' apartments, demanding to know what is going on. The chanting turns out to be nothing more than morning prayers for the Islamic interns, and the music abruptly shifts from eerie to comical, reinforcing the juxtaposition between imagined malice and actual benignity. Even after the misunderstanding is straightened out, Wada remains belligerent. And there are some set phrases here that I've translated into English set phrases. Quote, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do. This is the land of the kami and the Buddha. If you don't want to do that, then get out." End quote. She shouts at Rubel. Taka starts at this statement and scolds her. "Wada, that's tasteless. It's discrimination." The residents' sentiments towards the interns gradually worsens from there. As members of the complex start to disappear, the residents automatically suspect the interns. Rumors begin to spread that one of the interns kidnapped the missing people. Kimi suggests a shave ice party to bring everyone together, and Taka notes that the intern's dietary needs should be taken into account. Good for one. After a discussion with Rebel, the interns agree to make the fruit sauce for the party to ensure everything is prepared accordingly. The sauce is prepared, and everyone appears to be growing closer, until a dog's severed head is discovered in the fruit sauce. Once more, the residents immediately leap to blame the interns in their mess, with one unnamed resident declaring that it was those weirdos. The party then devolves into both sides accusing the other of sacrificing the dog. As the third episode progresses, the audience sees various tense interactions between residents and interns. This state of affairs eventually leads to Rebel leaving in the night. After Rebel's flight, the audience never sees the interns again. Presumably, other than Rebel, they are slain in the Koshide's attack. While the audience is encouraged to see the interns in a negative light, the Koshide family is painted as a typical middle-class Japanese family. Shortly after the first interaction between Wada and the interns, the remainder of the Koshide family, Keiko, spouse to Seiichi, and Yuri, begin to meet the residents. The residents praise Yuri's manners, and Keiko apologizes for any trouble they may have caused in their coming, establishing both as phenotypical Japanese following social conventions. The narrative focuses relatively little on Keiko and Seiichi until the night they slaughter the residents of the complex. Often, these are prosaic, kindly interactions which reinforce both the assumed well-meaning nature of the family and their normality to the audience. For example, in episode 2, Keiko comforts Yuri, telling her how hard it is to get used to living in a new place. When Kimi comes to ask for help with the shaved ice party, Keiko offers whatever help she's able and praises Kimi's idea of bringing the community together. Before the party, Keiko also expresses a desire to fit in at the complex and offers to help the elderly gentleman however she can. After the party turns sour, Seiichi gathers the residents together and suggests that they form a community watch organization. What could be wrong with that? Later, when Wada comes to visit, Keiko is seen exiting the bathroom with a cloth over her mouth, implying that the stress caused by the social tension in the complex is making her ill. Yet there are cracks in the Koshide's armor. The first and most notable sign of their villainy is the presence of a large kukri-style knife up in the upper right corner in the Koshide home, the sheath of which appears to bear a stylized Cthulhu face. The camera lingers on the knife as Kimi and Keiko speak, but without any meaning to attach to it, the audience quickly forgets its presence. Likewise, when Seiichi suggests that they form a community watch, Kobayashi notes to Taka that the watch captains will be reporting directly to Seiichi. This takes on an ominous tone when Taka reminds Kobayashi of how oppressive the neighborhood washids, the tonarigumi, became during the 40s. Eventually, the mask that the Koshides wear drops, and the slaughter of Housing Complex C begins. Interestingly, many of the same traits which mark the Koshides as an ideal Japanese family remain with them as they slaughter the residents. When Seiichi attacks Kimi with the kukri blade and a crowbar, he enters her apartment with a hearty, "Good evening, so sorry to trouble you." Likewise, when Keiko assaults Khan and he gets the better of her, she begs him, "Please forgive me, if I don't kill you, my husband..." And then assuming that Seiichi is forcing Keiko to hurt others, Khan releases her, at which point she finishes her sentence with, "He won't praise me," with a twisted smile on her face and attacks him again. Against the backdrop of the slaughter of Housing Complex C, the Koshide's idealization takes a horrific turn. In the end, Housing Complex C makes a very Japanese appeal to its watchers. Kimi explains to Yuri that she enjoyed living among humans and being kind with them. It turns out that Kimi isn't the unfeeling alien god that Lovecraft would have made her out to be. Instead, she's been present in Kurosaki all of these centuries because she took an interest in humanity. According to Kimi, quote, "The only thing that matters to me is eternity. That's it," end quote. Kimi had lived alongside humankind to see if they were worthy of this gift of eternity, but humanity was incapable of maintaining the social harmony necessary for it. This discussion is framed by Taka's earlier comment regarding the time loop in which Kurosaki is trapped. He notes to Kobayashi, quote, "That god's wish was for everyone to get along. That's why time stopped for Housing Complex C in the peaceful year 2000. That is, in a seemingly simpler time before the world seemed to stop getting along. Specifically, Taka seems to be making an oblique reference to 9/11, which was covered extensively by Japanese media outlets. As the Japan Times wrote, quote, 9/11 was a wake-up call to the Japanese people that the 21st century would not be an era of everlasting peace, and that the entire world would have to deal with existential threats like radical Islamic terrorism, end quote. It likewise was perceived as moving Japan away from its status as a pacifist state and towards more active military deployment, another way in which the nation was perceived as failing to get along with others. This more peaceful time also emerges inside of Kimi's speech to Yuri. She scolds Yuri's father for thinking that the sacrifices that he commits, sacrifices which cause others not to get along, will restore her child, Cthulhu. Instead, power brought up by these sacrifices simply calls things, quote, from across the sea, end quote. Specifically, Kimi claims that the power summoned something in 2011, a reference to the Tohoku earthquake and resultant tsunami that devastated Japan. Here, the inability to get along is paralleled with a threat to life and infrastructure on a massive scale. Then Kimi's threats grow more grave. Quote, humans always turn into idiots like you and self-destruct. You are not worthy of eternity, and the twinkle I saw was probably just a passing optical illusion. Know this, because of your folly, thou art one step closer to thine ending. For the first time, Kimi shifts from a childlike manner of speaking into a mode more befitting of a god's pronouncement, a pronouncement that seems less directed at Yuri and more towards the audience. Doom will come from humankind's inability to get along, a doom that has already been felt in microcosm in the Tohoku earthquake and resultant tsunami. Kimi is a very different Yog-Sothoth from Lovecraft's creation. The alien deity has been adapted to highlight a perceived failure of Japan to live up to its ideal of social harmony. By seeing phenotypical outsiders as threatening, the residents of the complex failed to live up to the societal ideal, privileging the phenotypical Japanese newcomers who bring disaster, not just to the complex, but also to the nation as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming so late in the day. I'm going to try to keep my energy up because it's that time of the day anyway. So my presentation is called Memories of Tentacles, Life and Lovecraft in the Works of Aramata Hiroshi. Since the publication of his groundbreaking fantasy series, Teito Monogatari, or Tales of the Imperial Capital, Aramata Hiroshi has been a leading author and public intellectual in Japan. A true polymath, Aramata has authored dozens of books, more than dozens, almost 100 really, in genres as diverse as fantasy, horror, histories of science and the occult, folklore, literary criticism, and even naturalist encyclopedias, such as the 1989 Birds of the World, as painted by the 19th century artists. Moreover, his nearly 3-decade collaborations with best-selling manga artist Mizuki Shigeru, horror author Kyogoku Natsuhiko, and folklorist Komatsu Kazuhiko has redefined the study of monsters and supernatural history, and was a major contribution to the so-called yokai boom, or interest in Japanese monsters. Though eclipsed by the fame of his other work, Aramata was also one of the earliest translators of the work of H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu Mythos writers in Japan. He even contributed to the subgenre himself. So my purpose here with this talk is to trace the emergence of Lovecraft in Japan through the career of Aramata Hiroshi. I'm going to briefly talk about his different works, his collaborations, and of course the touchstone of his career, Teito Monogatari. And finally, I want to explore how elements of Japanese fantasy, horror, and yokai culture have been the product of cross-pollination between the works of H.P. Lovecraft and their reimaginings by Aramata. One thing I hope to convince you of is that the emergence of Japanese fantasy isn't a strictly Japanese thing. Often when people perceive that genre, they think of it as sort of enclosed, as being, culturally distinct. But it's really the product of a series of interchanges over a long period of time. So the first question is, why is Lovecraft so popular in Japan? It's difficult to overstate this popularity. I would even go so far to suggest that Lovecraft's work is a kind of urtext for the genre of Japanese fantasy. Japanese fantasy offers a glimpse of how maybe the fantasy genre might have emerged if you were to replace Tolkien's Lord of the Rings with Lovecraft's work. In fact, the emergence of Lord of the Rings tropes in Japan only really comes about in the 80s and 90s with the rising popularity of Dungeons and Dragons. That's really what's filtering those tropes. But even if you look at tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons isn't the most popular in Japan. It's actually Call of Cthulhu. So a central question guiding my interest in Aramata Hiroshi and his career trajectory is how it offers an explanation for why Lovecraft is so popular. Questions that I think about are where does the genre of modern Japanese fantasy come from? How are its roots different from Western fantasy? How does Japanese fantasy emerge through a series of exchanges, I'm arguing? And to get at all of these questions, as Mike said, we have a volume coming out, Eldritch Islands, next year. So if this sort of thing interests you, please look at the volume. So Aramata Hiroshi is the guy smiling on the right, but you might recognize the face on the left. The face on the left is Mizuki Shigeru. He is probably the second most famous manga artist in Japan ever. Only Tezuka Osamu is better known. A little bit about Aramata. He's a known bibliophile and polymath with huge private collections of rare texts. He's published on, as I said, just about everything. He's translated many works into English, and he's even a Cthulhu Mythos writer himself. But he's also known for being a close friend of Mizuki Shigeru. They collaborated with each other throughout most of their lives. And his work, Teito Monogatari, made him one of the best-selling fantasy authors in Japan. One of the things I like about him is he obviously has a sense of humor. He doesn't take himself quite too seriously. He's a public intellectual, I think, in the United States, in Japan, in a way that we don't quite have in the United States anymore. He participates in local festivals, is a central figure of Japanese monster studies, and as you can tell here, he loves cosplay. So he leads a lot of these cosplay activities at various yokai and monster studies conferences across Japan. He's the kind of public intellectual that is made like the honorary chair of large libraries and institutions all across Japan, from the Manga Museum and Research Center in Kyoto to the new Kadokawa Museum in Saitama, which if you visit Japan, I strongly urge you to visit. It's absolutely like phenomenal. This is the outside. That's a library of books on the inside. And there's curious things about that. Yeah, I use this picture of Mike and I in Japan. This is actually at the museum. There's a part of it when you get to the very top in the library where it's supposed to represent what's going on inside Aramata's head, a kind of secret staircase into his mind to show you the texts that are at the heart of things and at the heart of his work. So this photograph is from that hidden staircase in the Kadokawa Museum. But it describes the staircase as kind of a walk through the shelves of his mind. The shelves are full of books of all kinds, but one can't help but notice the huge amount of encyclopedic works. But as you climb up the stairs of that staircase, you start to increasingly run into the occult, more and more books about occult in various ways, and finally, when you reach the apex at the top of the staircase, sitting there in a privileged position is the entire collection of weird tales. Which is right behind us. And like you can take them out and look at them. There's no security or anything. I don't know, what do you think the full collection was going for? Like,
I checked, it was just slightly shy of $200,000.
Yeah, $200,000 is the cost of the whole collection. But anyway, it's there at the apex of the staircase, as though this is sort of the central text in Aramata's life, when he is an expert on encyclopedic works. He's an expert in taxonomy, biology, chemistry, literary theory. But somehow this is at the top. His work with Mizuki Shigeru, as I was saying, is really where his reputation begins. So Aramata was important for the work with Mizuki, but let me just tell you a little bit about Mizuki Shigeru if you don't know. He was born in Totori, famously drafted into the war in 1942, where he was deployed to Papua New Guinea. He caught malaria, lost friends, lost his left arm, And his experience there left him deeply committed to pacifism. So when he returned to Japan after the war, he taught himself how to draw manga with his remaining arm. And he's particularly known for the manga Gegege no Kitaro, or Kitaro of the Graveyard, which came out in 1960, as you can see here. But for the next 45 years, he published a prolific amount of yokai, or Japanese monster manga. Apart from Kitaro, he's famous for the figure of Nonomba, a sort of recollection of his grandmother, who told him all of these monster stories in his childhood. He was one of the earliest manga adaptations of Lovecraft. So the text Chite no Ashioto, or Footsteps from Beneath, is an adaptation he did of the Dunwich horror. It was adapted in 1962, following an earlier introduction of the tale by Japanese author of detective fiction and horror, Edogawa Rampo. Many aspects of the tale are quite faithful adaptations, but he does add his sort of characteristic element of humor. But the way that they work together and the nature of the collaboration between Mizuki and Aramata really emerges in their... I struggle to describe what this text is. It's a yokai magazine, a magazine about yokai monsters and research, but it's kind of at the boundary of hobbyist and academic. So the kinds of people that publish in it are, professors from universities all across Japan, but at the same time, it's also read by people who are deeply interested in monsters as hobbyists. This has been running from 1997 to the present, so about 30 years. Unfortunately, Mizuki passed away a number of years ago, but he still remains a central figure there. You can notice their faces, right? So Mizuki's at the top. He was the senior and sort of treated as the great sensei, Mizuki Shigeru. Aramata's in the middle there. And then the third founder at the bottom, that's Natsuhiko Kyogoku, who is a very famous horror writer in Japan. And you see them actually represented all of the time. The three faces are visible in even recent editions. But the reason I draw your attention to this is because in an early reflective essay on the founding of this journal in yokai studies, it depicts Mizuki as the main thinker, with Kyogoku and Aramata as a sort of devil and angel figures sitting on each of his shoulders, like a sort of muse. And the essay explains that while Kyogoku urged Mizuki to focus on Japanese history and culture, it was Aramata who was a sort of transnational cosmopolitan thinker and tried to bring Mizuki's yokai into global comparisons with monsters across the world, including, of course, the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Indeed, one of the central essays in Kai that's an ongoing series was called Yokai Ethnography, and it features Aramata and Mizuki on the road, scouring locations for monsters such as the Egyptian pyramids or the rainforests of British Columbia, or also Lovecraft's home of Providence, Rhode Island. So through their collaborations, Aramata and Mizuki put yokai studies into conversation with monsters of cosmic horror. These are just some examples of Aramata's other work. As I said, he might actually have published over 100 books. I haven't verified that, but it's a phenomenal number. So here there's a text about monster studies. Then to the right of it is Teito Monogatari, his landmark fantasy epic. To the right of that is his work in the Yokai Journal. And then finally on the right is his illustrated rare and extinct books of the world. In his biographies, Aramata discusses how his own encyclopedic interests reflected Lovecraft's own desire for knowledge. Both of them were interested in science from an early age. In particular, they shared a keen interest in evolutionary taxonomy. These images show some of Aramata's amateur work done in actually high school and early university. So you can see here how he would eventually go on to write encyclopedias of fish and birds in the 80s and 90s. So he was preoccupied with all knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge of the world, biology, history, art history, architecture, occultism, occult science. After graduating Keio University with a law degree, he worked as a computer programmer and systems engineer while making contributions to the World Encyclopedia. So when I say that he's a polymath, this is really what I mean here, an expert in virtually all things. Lovecraft himself was fascinated with multiple forms of knowledge: history, genealogy, ancient myths and legends, particularly of Egypt, architecture, local history. This photo here shows Lovecraft doing one of his favorite things, which was visiting graveyards. That, of course, matches with common perceptions of him, but he wasn't going to graveyards because it was macabre. He was interested in family lineage. That's really what brought him there. A story about Lovecraft that probably people don't know that really runs against common perceptions is he was so interested in the architecture of houses that he would walk up to houses and knock on the door and tell people, like, oh, can I see the inside of your house? Would you mind showing me around? That's, I think, a side of Lovecraft we perhaps don't think about so much. But such was his desire for knowledge. In Aramata's interviews, he describes how Lovecraft's interests matched his own across all of these disciplines, actually particularly also science fiction, which becomes an element and central premise for cosmic horror. What if humans aren't the fittest, for example. But anyway, this is to say that Aramata's own journey as a polymath and scholar was influenced by Lovecraft's journey as well. Aramata has such a presence in Japan that entire sections of libraries have been devoted to his work in various disciplines. And this actually, I think, serves to elevate the studies of Lovecraft and the occult. So for example, when perusing the various disciplines as laid out by Aramata, you see them as they would appear as history, taxonomy, astronomy, art history, and the occult. So by that inclusion, with all of these other obviously recognizable disciplines, I think it elevates occult studies and led to an occult bloom in Japan as well. So how did Aramata become enthralled with Lovecraft in the first place? This began with a science fiction reading circle he had in high school, but soon expanded into a group of amateur translators during his first year at Keio University when he was about 20 years old. You can see this is all his work. I mean, even that sketch of Lovecraft, he did himself. Yeah, they launched a magazine, these amateurs, called Little Weird in 1967, a sort of hobbyist magazine where they translated science and weird fiction, including many of Lovecraft's texts. They wanted to increase the circulation of his texts in Japan. Aramata's interest in Lovecraft also led him to voraciously read the pulp magazine Weird Tales, as you saw in that previous image, as well as anything published by Arkham House, the publisher founded by friends of Lovecraft after his early death to publish his works. Aramata translated even relatively minor authors, particularly those, as I said, published by Arkham House. So here's a sketch he did and translation of Manly Wade Wellman's Who Fears the Devil. And from this amateur work in Little Weird, he started translating Lovecraft professionally. The first instance of this is a translation of The Shadow Out of Time in Shonen King magazine in 1968. The audience for this magazine would be adolescent boys. And while Aramata wasn't the very first translator of Lovecraft in Japan, he was the first to introduce the Cthulhu Mythos writers to a Japanese audience. These writers, many of whom were acquaintances of Lovecraft, wrote speculative fiction within the cosmic world that Lovecraft created, borrowing many of the names of Lovecraft's elder gods, such as Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, or Nyarlathotep. During his lifetime, Lovecraft was a very generous collaborator. He encouraged others in his circle of friends to participate in this exchange, and he playfully called it Yog-Sothothery. So he didn't take it quite too seriously. In Aramata's introduction to the Japanese version, he draws attention to the different ways that these authors have made Lovecraft's universe their own. He argues that these hybrid worlds represent various interpretive possibilities for Lovecraft, which he feels ought to be introduced to a Japanese audience. He concludes with the suggestion that the Cthulhu Mythos fiction would be well at home in Japan and connects various elements of it to Japanese culture and civilization, such as ancient ruins of the Kofun period or Shintoist myth histories. Aramata has actually even published Cthulhu mythos stories of himself, such as The Road, which was anthologized in Asamatsu Ken's Hishinkai, or Lairs of the Hidden Gods. The story is somewhat autobiographical, where a Japanese protagonist, an academic, travels to Boston for a conference, but makes a side trip to Lovecraft's hometown of Providence. There, he discovers that Lovecraft's life and legacy is frozen in time and ties into major junctures of history. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 that destroyed Tokyo is connected to Lovecraft's life. Actually, this is a really fairly common trope, the connection of disaster to ideas of cosmic horror and the elder gods, like in Mike's presentation we just saw before us. But he goes a little bit farther. He also makes a connection between Lovecraft's Providence and the fall of the World Trade Center, which again, we see, and sort of argues that through Lovecraft's work, the junctures of history in Japan and the United States are connected. They are all bound up in Lovecraft's life and legacy. This brings me to his most commonly circulated text, which is Teito Monogatari, or The Tale of the Imperial Capital. This came out in about 10 volumes from 1985 to 89. You can think of it as a sort of Japanese version of Lord of the Rings. It has that amount of impact in Japan. It sold over 5 million copies. It's a work of epic and historical fantasy, and it takes place over about 100 years. So from the end of the Meiji period in 1868, all the way up to the 1990s. The story is a secret or occult history of Tokyo, where the fortunes of the city are shaped by the hidden influence of the occult, gods, and demons. Aramata draws heavily on his knowledge of history in writing the narrative and connects various events such as the Meiji Restoration, Great Kanto earthquake, redevelopment of the city, and the building of the subway tunnels in the post-war, experiences in the Pacific War, and Japan's invasion of Manchuria. So though the story begins around 1868, it draws on earlier myth histories, in particularly the figure of Taira no Masakado, who you see depicted in this image. Masakado was a powerful warlord who rebelled against the central government in Tokyo. He was killed in battle, and there's legends that his head, he was originally from Edo, sort of flew off of its body and returned to Edo, where it was bound, buried in a mound that was called a kubizuka. And people worshipped it there, particularly because Masakado was viewed as a fearful deity that could cause all sorts of disasters. After his death, there's rumors of great swaths of butterflies that flew across the city. So he's, on the one hand, a kind of demon, but he's a demon that must be worshipped in order for Edo or Tokyo to be safe. So there's a sort of tension there. The city of Edo grew rapidly at the end of the Warring States period in 1603, and the shogun who led this long era of peace was said to have consulted the principles of fusui or feng shui in choosing the location of the capital. So you see here all of the four divine beasts that are oriented around the capital, the mountain in the north, the water in the south, the road going west to east. These are all in accordance with feng shui ideas of how a city should be built. But Aramata plays with this idea a little bit. So instead, in Teito Monogatari, Aramata connects the geomantic ley lines not to the imperial palace, but to the grave of Masakado. So the idea is that by being placed in this particular space, there's lines of energy that intersect. But the grave of Masakado is really close to the imperial palace, so it can be argued instead that the point of convergence is actually at Masakado's gravesite. So thus, Edo or Tokyo is built on a kind of lie. The feng shui of the city is supposed to elevate the castle and what later becomes the imperial palace in 1868, but it's actually connected to the wrathful deity Masakado. In the novel, the emperor is a kind of pathetic demon. He has to drink cocktails of human organs to survive and worships Masakado for his borrowed power. all of the misfortunes of Tokyo, such as the Great Kanto earthquake, are the result of Masakado stirring. So the plot of the narrative of the novel is basically how to thwart the awakening of Masakado by the antagonist, this figure named Yasunori Kato, who is a master of sorcery, a sort of yin-yang sorcery called Onmyodo. The success of the books led to films. At the time of creation, Teito Monogatari, the film, was the most expensive production ever made in Japan. And actually, as a result of this, Teito Monogatari fuses and reinterprets Japanese folklore and yokai culture. The Lovecraftian elements of Teito Monogatari thus find themselves in popular representations of yokai. So for these three very famous yokai films, the Great Yokai War are at the top. After the Teito Monogatari films come out, the stories of both become fused together in new Great Yokai War movies that have come out in recent years. So this is actually just a map of what I was telling you about with the ley lines. So you see the Imperial Palace there. Tairo no Masakado's grave is right beside it. So Aramata has obviously done his homework here. After Masakado became a protector deity for Edo, Tokugawa Ieyasu was also, the shogun was afraid of angering the spirit and also made offerings to appease it. A number of accidents developed around the notion of a curse. Actually, the grave itself, this is in a very expensive area of Tokyo, but every time the mound is said to have been tried to move, there's been terrible disasters that have befallen the construction companies. So actually, it still exists there today. You can visit it. The films themselves went on to become cult films. They were circulated in the United States as well, where they were sort of known as those weird Japanese films at the back of the video store. And of course, Yasunori Kato inspired numerous characters, particularly for Street Fighter. If you're familiar with Street Fighter, the villain is actually based on Kato. So Teito Monogatari's influence is huge, but the reason that I keep comparing it to Lord of the Rings is because it reshaped the genre of fantasy by bringing in a number of elements that previously really weren't included in Japanese fantasy texts. Probably the largest of which is Chinese traditions. So these include the figure of Abe no Seimei, a kind of Heian-era wizard, kind of like a Merlin who controlled spirits. The use of Taoist sorcery or yin-yang sorcery, the symbol of which is the red pentagram that you see there, but also the use of feng shui as an ordering principle of the land and part of a broader Taoist cosmology. In a lot of fantasy texts now, you see the use of a luopan, which is a kind of a geomantic compass up on the right, and then various kinds of sorcery. In Japanese popular culture now, you see this all over the place. Really, since Teito Monogatari's work came out, Chinese elements are all over Japanese fantasy. But what exactly is the Lovecraftian elements that I'm referring to here in Teito Monogatari? So, while it isn't a Cthulhu mythos story, so Cthulhu or some other gods aren't actually named, there are a lot of, I think, powerful parallels. The first of which being the worship of secret or hidden gods, particularly the idea that who you're worshiping isn't who you think it is. The danger of one god being disguised as another. An emphasis that hidden knowledge really reveals new historical interpretations. So as we've mentioned already, the 3/11 disaster, 9/11, Great Kanto earthquake, the Pacific War, all of these things being rewritten in a kind of occult history is a really common practice among Cthulhu mythos writers. A revival of interest in cults and occult knowledge. So in this case, the practices of sorcery that I've told you about, of feng shui. And then finally, fourth, marks of atavism, degeneration, and fear of miscegenation, which is a popular, a common motif in a lot of Lovecraft's work. So I'll just read you this passage from The Shadow out of Innsmouth to sort of show you what I mean. It was then that I began to study the mirror with mounting alarm. The slow ravages of disease are not pleasant to watch, but in my case there was something subtler and more puzzling in the background. My father seemed to notice it too, for he began looking at me curiously and almost affrightedly. What was taking place in me? Could it be that I was coming to resemble my grandmother and Uncle Douglas? One night I had a frightful dream in which I met my grandmother under the sea. She lived in a phosphorescent palace of many terraces with gardens of strange leprous corals and grotesque brachiate efflorescences, and welcomed me with a warmth that may have been sardonic. She had changed, as those who take to the water change, and told me she had never died. Instead, she had gone to a spot her dead son had learned about, and had leaped to a realm whose wonders, destined for him as well, he had spurned with a smoking pistol. This was to be my realm too. I could not escape it. I would never die, but would live with those who had lived since before man ever walked the earth. So Lovecraft's racism is no secret. His xenophobia during his stay in New York near the beginning of his career is particularly heinous. As we've mentioned, the racism is a key component in his construction of the cosmic other, a fear of strange people and their stranger gods. But with the work of Aramata, when this racism is sort of turned inwardly. So the greatest horror for some of Lovecraft's protagonists was the fear of the sort of miscegenation of the self, of the discovery of racial hybridity, or in their view, a kind of contamination, in the view that they as protagonists have a tainted family line that they previously believed to be auspicious. So the true horror then is the realization of the protagonist that they are the racial other that they despise, and that they have connections to an eldritch god through that otherness. This is basically the premise of Teito Monogatari, but felt on a national scale. The Emperor of Japan, believed divine, is revealed not to be a descendant of the sun goddess, but to have made bargains with the vengeful spirit of Masakado. He is depicted as sickly, demonic, inhuman, drinking human organs to sustain himself. And it follows that if the Emperor is demonic, as the father of all Japanese people, so must they be. The natural disasters that befall Japan then are not natural at all, but the product of an accursed race. So just to offer a brief conclusion, this year is the 40th anniversary of Teito Monogatari. The most recent edition of the folklore magazine Kai celebrates Aramata's redefining of the fantasy genre and the wedding of folklore and fantasy. Aramata is responsible for the reshaping of the fantasy genre, yokai culture, Japanese monster studies, and popular culture generally. We in the United States are actually on the receiving end of Lovecraftian fantasy products reflected through the works of Japanese authors and artists. A lot of what we think of as Japanese popular culture owes a debt to Lovecraft, and of course a greater debt still to the Japanese authors such as Aramata that have reinterpreted him. And sometimes actually these influences might even escape our notice. For example, the best-selling video game Elden Ring comes to mind. But all of this is partially due to Aramata's and others' transformative exposure to the works of Lovecraft in their youth. Cthulhu Mythos writer Asamatsu Ken has called attention to these formative experiences and recognizes that he's called attention to these formative experiences and recognition that they, as Japanese, are the very others of Lovecraft's work, and therefore the perfect conduit to continue it. These experiences are, in his words, their memories of tentacles. Thank you.
So as we said, I'm not Kyu, but we'll be reading his paper so that he can be here in spirit. This paper focuses on Morohoshi Daijiro, whose reputation as one of the greatest manga artists spans horror, dark fantasy, Swiftian social satire, and science fiction. I will focus on Morohoshi's Yokai Hunter, Demon Hunter series, serialized 1974 to 2015, although the comics set in the same world have continued into the 2020s, which transposes the Lovecraftian ecology of elder gods and cosmic horrors into a distinctly Japanese context. As we shall examine below, Morohoshi's Demon Hunter series is directly influenced by the weird fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, including the Cthulhu mythos. However, these Lovecraftian elements are selectively adapted and indigenized through invocation of the specifically Japanese mythologies, cultural tropes, and iconographies. Morohoshi's Demon Hunter series serves as an exemplary illustration of not only the processes by which the Japanese popular culture draws from the originally foreign Lovecraftian elements, but also the cross-cultural, indeed global, appeals of Lovecraftian tropes and ideas. This paper will also address some of Morohoshi's less mythologically informed weird manga from the early 1970s to 1980s. Disturbing, sometimes grotesque, yet literary and thoughtful, these works shed light on the social psychology and cultural preoccupations of Japanese society as it has transitioned from the high-growth period of 1955 to 1973 to the era of economic uncertainty following the Nixon shock and formation of OPEC. Morohoshi was born in 1949 in Nagano Prefecture, but grew up in Adachi District, Tokyo, a consummate urbanite. His biography reflects social changes of the immediate post-war Japan, belonging to a generation with a skyrocketing birth rate and marked by massive migrations from the countryside to major cities, Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. Morohoshi was briefly employed at the Tokyo Metropolitan Electricity Research Institute, but continued to aspire to be a manga artist. In 1970, he managed to debut in the Com magazine, published by the Mushi Production Corporation, founded by Tezuka Osamu, 1928 to 1989, the famed creator of Astro Boy and the aforementioned first most popular manga artist in Japan. Soon after, in 1974, he began serializing the Demon Hunter series in Shukan Shonen Jumpu, Weekly Boys Jump, one of the premier weekly magazines devoted to manga, launched by Shueisha in 1968. This series became an enormous hit and is still considered Morohoshi's representative opus by many fans today. The Demon Hunter series transposes the Lovecraftian ecology of elder gods and cosmic creatures into a specifically Japanese milieu in the form of cryptoarchaeology of Japanese myths. The protagonist of the series is a former professor of archaeology named Hieda Reijiro. Always clad in a conservative black suit, but incongruently coiffed with straight, long black hair, he is considered a heretic due to his Kolchak or Mulder and Scully-like propensity to dig into mysterious and unexplained events and phenomena, suffering the disdain and indifference of mainstream academia. We've all been there. The first installment of the series, The Black Investigator, originally published and hereafter OP in Weekly Boys Jump, number 37, 1974, introduces Hieda as a prototypical lifter of the veil who visits a desolate village in Kyushu to be consulted by a young man named Yabe Masao. Masao's father, a local historian, was found gruesomely decapitated inside an ancient burial chamber known as Hiruko Kofun. Readers familiar with the Japanese creation myths chronicled in Japan's first national histories, Kojiki, the Chronicles of the Myths, Imperial Genealogies, and Historical Anecdotes, compiled around 711 to 712, and Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720, also the first official history of the imperial house, would immediately realize that the name Hiruko refers to the deformed progeny of the primordial deities Izanami, female, and Izanagi, male. It is a scion of their first attempt at creating the world before they successfully gave birth to the sun goddess Amaterasu and the moon god Tsuki, or Tsuku or Tsukiyomi. Hiruko is spelled with a character signifying leech and child. Nihon Shoki states that Hiruko was not able to stand up on its own legs even when it reached the age of 3. Subsequently, he was sent away in a boat made of reed to be expunged from the lineage of those gods that ultimately became ancestors of the Japanese emperor. As depicted in the manga, the monster responsible for the Yabe father's disappearance, referred to as the Hiruko, is a featureless, malformed being that resembles a primitive stick figure painting emblazoned in the chamber walls. Found alive, the elder Yabe is revealed to have, in the process of a botched interdimensional teleportation, become a ghastly hybrid creature with a human head fused to the stick figure-like body of the Hiruko. He explains to his horrified son and Hieda that, quote, "It was just as written on the pages of Kojiki. Hiruko is an imperfect form of life, what we might call a pseudo-life form. Sealed off from our world, Hiruko became an evil being, burning with hatred toward all things natural, living in the nether regions of the earth," end quote. Aided by Yabe, Hieda manages to seal off Hiruko and prevent its scheme to invade the human world. Throughout the series, Morohoshi employs a graphic style intimating that the primitive design of the Japanese ancient culture, such as Jomon pottery, were not reductions, essentialisms, or distorted depictions of the natural but rather depictions of the natural but literal representation of hybrid monstrosities. These grotesque forms are uncanny for the Japanese readers in the sense that they would be strangely familiar, recalling memories from the fairy tales, folklore, school textbooks, archaeological exhibitions, and other cultural resources. A clay idol with gaping mouths where an abdomen and legs should be, a sea serpent with the face of a human child, and so on. Morohoshi further builds on the alternative natural history of the Hiroko in the episode The Return of the Dead. According to Hieda, an evolutionary tree of life on Earth as we know it has its shadow version, on which the Hiroko of the Black Investigator is marked as one of the intermediately developed species in the dead. The archaeologist visits another family with a teenage son. This time, in the dead, the archaeologist visits another family with a teenage son, this time a vaguely aristocratic household in an unidentified Japanese town flooded by severe rainstorms, to investigate the seemingly supernatural returns of the recently dead. It is revealed that the boy narrator's mother had been trained as a shaman by her grandmother, and that her black magic ritual of restoring flesh and blood to her husband's skeletons actually worked. Unfortunately for her family, the reconstructed body of her husband is merely a vessel for a more evolved pseudo-life form, capable of speech, social organization, and presiding over religious rituals designed to bring back the series equivalent of an elder god, a cross between Gaia and Shub-Niggurath. These rituals are meant to return the universe into a state of pre-creation, void what we humans call chaos. The more evolved pseudo-life forms, having assumed the human form as zombies, are shown as to disgustingly consume protoplasmic lesser beings, as predators higher in the evolutionary hierarchy. These examples show that the earlier episodes of the Demon Hunter series closely follow the Lovecraftian strategies of myth-making without directly borrowing from the Cthulhu mythos. Morohoshi draws upon the ancient Japanese myths and the uncanny responses their artifacts and designs generate among the contemporary readers to construct an alternative mythos more attuned to the idioms and lexicography of Japanese culture. He reminds his readers that the Lovecraftian monsters of the Demon Hunter are, after all, the beings who reproduced by the same gods, who could just as well be gods of evolution rather than Japanese kami, as humanity. They are our misshapen brethren, the mythical equivalent of a deformed sibling hidden in the attic or basement in a Gothic melodrama. In this sense, Robert Waugh's designation of the Shoggoth in Lovecraft's Add the Mountains of Madness as a mirage looming over us, and the humans as parallel, quote, mirages, reflected, refracted, and magnified, distortions of the Shoggoths and of the makers who made us both, end quote, has a resonance with Morohoshi's pseudo-life forms that are disturbingly and uncannily familiar to the modern Japanese readers. However, Morohoshi continued to invoke Lovecraftian tropes and themes in his works, less concerned with the mythological analogues of the Cthulhu mythos. Those more geared towards social satires focused on alienation of the post-industrial Japanese. In a 1979 piece, Child's Play, Morohoshi introduces a middle-class salaryman patriarch who learns that his son, Takashi, is secretly raising a pet. He imagines to his complacent amusement the pet to be a stray puppy. However, to his shock and repulsion, he discovers that the pet is an amorphous mass of protoplasm with a pair of undeveloped eyes and a toothy gaping hole for a mouth. The father attempts to discard the creature, but fails when the latter pleads to him, extending a pseudopod-like arm and haltingly calling him daddy. He subsequently learns that not only Takashi, but all other children in the neighborhood are being replaced by the amoebic creatures that gradually take the form of human children. The horror of the piece comes less from the Shoggoth-like creature itself, never seen to be doing anything abject such as eating or absorbing human children, but from the complacency of Japanese parents. They do not mind that these hideous creatures are taking the place of their children, as long as the former play by the social norms. Sorry, that's quite funny to me. Not putting one's elbow on the table while eating, for instance. And it fits into the roles expected of children. The father himself dreams or recalls, he's not certain which, that he might have been one of these disgusting pets that had replaced a human child at one point. This disturbing reflection leads to the realization that, stated in Lovecraftian terms, we are, or more precisely, we have always been, the Shoggoths. Morohoshi's tale intimates that Lovecraft's other world, the beyond as it were, is already present within the mundane, routinized life world of post-war Japan, yet its residents respond to it with dull indifference at best. As Morohoshi's world of the strange and the weird expanded and diversified into late 70s and 80s, it could become even more intensely folkloric and localized than its early 70s iterations, with some stories relying on all manners of pseudo- and crypto-archaeological ethnographic texts and artifacts. They sometimes incorporated the achievements of Japanese folklore studies, Minzokugaku, and their propensity towards taxonomy and evocation of the weird through classification and notation become pronounced in these stories, moving away from the imperial creation myths and by inference, the Japanese equivalent of elder gods. Indeed, the folklore explored in them needs not be strictly nativist in the sense that it had to have originated in Japan. One episode, The Tree of Life, is based on real-life histories of underground and indigenized Catholicism, shaped by the Tokugawa shogunate's extensive persecution and ban of the religion in 17th century. Here, Morohoshi adapts the indigenized Catholic theology of the Japanese hidden Christians into a fictional cosmology heretical to the Orthodox Catholic doctrines. In the episode, it is revealed that the descendants of Jusuheru, a Japanese dialectic pronunciation of Lucifer, who according to hidden Christian folklore was an earlier creation of Jehovah before Adam and Eve, cannot die and are, after certain times have passed, deposited in the underground inferno, condemned to writhe and moan in eternal undead torment. In this para-Catholic mythology that strongly echoes the pattern of the failed progeny, Hiroko, Jusuheru, Lucifer, had partaken of the fruit of eternal life, unlike Adam and Eve, who had consumed the fruit of wisdom. Therefore, human beings could claim intelligence but must die, whereas Lucifer's descendants live on eternally but are bereft of intelligence. Here, Morohoshi cannily mobilizes central elements of Christian theology, especially what Paul Ricoeur calls the Adamic myth, in which the origins of human evil, i.e. our sinful nature, are strictly anthropological, to defamiliarize or derealize it. The narratives of man's fall from grace, death, and resurrection of the Savior and salvation of mankind are all retained in form, but in substance tweaked into a weird mythology that evokes a sense of frisson, unease, and wonder in some readers in a way perhaps analogous to the effects produced by some Gnostic myths and their contemporary variants. Morohoshi's manga illustrates his shrewd and intelligent modes of adapting Lovecraftian elements into the Japanese context, finding analogies and parallels between the Cthulhu mythos and chronicles of the myriad of gods in native Japanese myths. He also draws upon Lovecraftian tropes and ideas, perhaps most significantly the notion of the beyond, a non-spiritual realm, and therefore accessible, contrary to some stereotypical views of Lovecraft, through scientific investigation, that lies beyond our sensory perceptions and intellectual capacity, and the lifters of veil, exemplified in Hieda Daijiro, who reveal the existence of the beyond to us, to explore alienation and complacency of post-war Japanese society. In his long career, Morohoshi further developed the character of Lifter of the Veil through 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century, to gradually phase out a male protagonist such as Hieda, and supplanting him with young females, shoujo. In these eras, his works turned more ludic and playful. A series of manga starring Shiori and Shimiko, 1995 to 2008, teenage daughters of booksellers, illustrates this trend best. The adventure of Shiori and Shimiko shapes up to be an affectionately satiric take on the Lovecraftian worldview that engage with the American Western literary genealogies of the weird in a knowing manner. The series includes such characters as Danichi, derived from the Dunwich of Dunwich Horror, a parody of Lovecraft himself, dressed mostly in black with a gaunt, long face. It is hinted that Dan, in his youthful days, had played a role similar to Hieda Daijiro, an investigator and exorcist of malignant entities from the beyond. He had apparently fallen in love and married his unnamed wife during one of the adventures into the beyond. The wife, very obviously not a human being, is usually presented as an oversized, vaguely Caucasian, disembodied face, as large as an adult human torso, and sometimes seen with long, tentacle-like limbs. But in everyday conversation, she is pleasant, polite, and behaves like a typical Japanese housewife. In the Hieronymus Bosch Lewis Carroll-inflected episode The Night Fish, Mrs. Dawn metamorphoses into a rather shapely mermaid-like humanoid, complete with scales and a tail. Moreover, the Dawn couple is raising a kindergarten-aged daughter named Cthulhu, a shapeshifter who occasionally yells, "Tekalili, tekalili," without rhyme or reason. In The Night Fish, Cthulhu-chan, as she is affectionately called, turns into a silly and messy amalgamation of various marine creatures, obviously a variant of a Shoggoth, but she is overjoyed to have extra options for transforming her body. Thus, in more recent decades, Morohoshi's Beyond is less a source of terror, abjection, and collapse of reason than a realm that could be traversed by the young female protagonist with special powers to access forbidden knowledge or test the possibilities of self-transformation. Nonetheless, Morohoshi's later works still draw upon Lovecraftian elements as resources for exploring the changes in Japanese society and its mentalités, its post-industrial evolution, transformations in gender relations, and subjectivities. And these shifts and explorations in his manga, ongoing at this moment, also testify to the continued relevance and strength of Lovecraftian tropes and themes in global popular culture.
All right, we have time for questions.
Hi. First, thank you very much for the presentations. One thing that is characterized by Lovecraftian fiction is that there's no real happy ending. It's like, it's very doom. It's very like, yeah, you might have been able to stop it right now, but eventually it'll come back. Does that translate over to the Japanese fiction as well? Because especially towards the end of that last essay, it kind of gets, we start to see maybe just like playing with the tropes rather than getting into tones and themes of what Lovecraft did.
Sure. So I can't speak for Kyu Hyun, that last paper, but I'll communicate that question to him. But when I think of the fiction more generally, I think there is a kind of twist on the unhappy ending. So the example I gave, right, where the protagonist realizes that their family is actually sort of connected to the elder gods somehow, and they undergo some transformation at the end, right? In that case, then the protagonist experiences horror as they're transforming, and that's the most horrific moment of the story. In a lot of the Japanese writers, the source of the horror is a little bit different, because they often end the same way, where a transformation happens, but when the protagonist realizes sort of, the legacy of their lineage is connected to Cthulhu or something, they become sort of exultant. And they start to embrace that. And it's like, oh yes, Japanese people by race are connected to these elder gods. This is my destiny. I accept this wholeheartedly. And I mean, then the reader experiences the horror then, right? Looking at the way that they've sort of embraced this transformation. But I mean, I don't know if you'd call that a happy ending, but it certainly doesn't end in a negative way for the protagonist, right? They see this as kind of they're accepting their fate and evolving into a higher form of being. Did you want to add to that, Mike?
I'm not sure if I can add much to that. I think that's a very kind of astute and fulfilling answer. I will say in Housing Complex C, certainly sort of following that idea of kindness and hope, we do see one of the protagonists kind of make it out alive, and seemingly with the blessing of Yog-Sothoth. It's unclear what that means, but it seems like that's keeping in a thematic element of that particular anime rather than a trend like what you're asking about.
Thank you. This might be a little bit self-serving because I'm very curious about sort of the place of the South or the South Seas in Japanese culture, and it seemed like a couple of times you mentioned like the old gods are coming from the South, or there's this imagination of being connected to the islands, which I know in other pop culture like Godzilla, et cetera, again, that's like the place where monsters come from, and I'm wondering how that along with Lovecraft, right, which I think also puts Cthulhu in the South Seas, like how those ideas are coming together, especially in this post-war era.
Tips. Oh, you, okay.
So this is actually a really direct reference inside of Housing Complex C, which actually kind of links up with an element that I wasn't able to talk about due to length restrictions. But Taka, our sort of traditional Lovecraftian antiquarian, he tells us that the origins of all the people in Kurosaki are in these South Sea peoples who are implied to be deep ones. And so we all of a sudden have this idea that before, whereas everyone has been presented to us as phenotypically and thus presumably genotypically Japanese, suddenly we have no idea what anybody's background at the housing complex could possibly be. And this links up also later when Wada, I forget the term that she uses all of a sudden, but it's sort of like offerings to the dead. And she says that this was a common thing that her parents had taught her and their parents had taught them, but it turns out to be a thing that the deep ones did to try to bring Cthulhu back. So all of a sudden we have this intimation that these seemingly genotypical Japanese people are in fact related to monsters.
I have a few ideas about the idea of Japanese people emerging from the South. So you mentioned Godzilla, for example. Part of the idea with kaiju, at least, and with Godzilla, it's because of the nuclear testing happening in the Pacific, right? That's what orients it that way. But in the case of these Lovecraft-influenced stories, there were also ideas circulating through Japanese ethnography at the time that the South was the origin of the Japanese people. So probably the most famous folklorist in Japan, named Yanagita Kunio, he wrote a kind of memoir called like Record of the South Seas, and he has this famous example of like a shell washing up on the shore, and thinking that this is actually came from the South, particularly somewhere like Okinawa. So if you know, Okinawa used to be the Ryukyu Kingdom, becomes part of Japan. Really geographically is close to Taiwan. Near the end of Yanagita's career, he makes this pivot, and he moves from saying that Japanese culture originally was not actually located in the mountains in the countryside, it's come from Okinawa, from the South Seas. So engagement with this folklorist, I think, is something a lot of these authors pick up on, because Yanagita was also a scholar of monsters. Pardon me? He starts working mostly about the 30s, 20s and 30s. So that is part of it. But because a lot of the Cthulhu Mythos writers also are tying things to historical events, there's one famous story where the person that brings Cthulhu to Japan is actually the Jesuit priest, Francis Xavier. And a lot of the travelers to Japan, they pass through the south, right? Okinawa is kind of their first stop, and then they land in Kyushu. In the case of Francis Xavier, that's where a lot of Japanese Christianity is based. So the story kind of flips the narrative on its head and says, well, actually, Francis Xavier's ship was abducted in the Pacific, and he was baptized in like the juices of Cthulhu, and he became, secretly practicing what we called Christianity. But by the time then they arrive through the south in Kyushu, they're starting this cult. So that's part of it. Also, just a larger discourse on kind of creative imagining of what could be in the South in a lot of ethnography. So off of Okinawa, there's part of Okinawa Prefecture is an island called Yonaguni. And if you look up Yonaguni, it's famous for an undersea ruins. It's called an undersea ruins. Geologists call it a formation. It's basically a series of steps that look like maybe it was a pyramid underground, but I think the consensus is that this is just a geological formation. But for a long time, there's been debate that maybe there was a kind of like Atlantis in the South Seas, and this also ties in really conveniently to ideas of strange people from the South, right? Finally, folklorists had an idea of a term called marebito, which means like people from across the sea. So the idea that Shinto gods in Japan actually crossed the ocean. And the ocean that is usually referred to as the South as well. So there's really a whole bunch of meanings associated with that South Ocean. So thank you for asking that.
So you were talking about how Aramata kind of brought a lot of Chinese influence to his writing. And I also understand that Okinawa has a lot of its own history apart from Japan, and if there was any of their kind of history or folklore that was kind of introduced to Japanese culture and like his stories.
So Aramata writing about Okinawa, that's a good question. So the Chinese stuff that he's bringing in tends to be quite a bit older. So there were, for example, novelists working in about the 16th century in Japan that had Chinese influence, but that sort of falls away. But actually, for example, the Hakenden, the Legend of 8 Dog Warriors, is based on the Chinese classic, the Suikoden. That's the Japanese pronunciation of it. You know it in English as water margin. But what Aramata does is he brings in these influences of Chinese fantasy that have sort of fallen off since probably about the 18th century. As far as I know, he hasn't written about Okinawa specifically. Most of his stuff is centered in Tokyo, because Teito Monogatari is called literally the tale of the imperial capital. So the premise here is like Tokyo is a fundamentally wrong, awful place. That's why it's localized there. But other Cthulhu Mythos writers have written about Okinawa a lot. Actually, in the same volume that I showed you where Aramata is published, there's another story called, I think it's April 1945 or 1941. It's describing a battle in Okinawa, and it basically depicts the Americans and the Japanese fighting inadvertently, while inadvertently being controlled by Cthulhu on one side and I think Yog-Sothoth on the other. So he rewrites the history of the war as a conflict between elder deities. So it's a good question. Certainly, I think the Battle of Okinawa is something that is used by Cthulhu Mythos writers, but Aramata directly not so much. But thank you for that question.
Hi. You mentioned it very briefly about Godzilla and kaiju, and I study Godzilla, so I just want to know where you kind of see Godzilla and other kaiju kind of fitting in essentially this kind of pantheon of yokai and Lovecraftian monsters. Where kind of is that place for this very distinct kind of Japanese monster?
I would actually probably not include kaiju with yokai, and I'd actually even probably separate them from the sort of the Lovecraftian influence too. I tend to read kaiju more as connected to war trauma. So in the case of Godzilla, I would connect it historically to what was called the Lucky Dragon incident. So a fishing boat that got contaminated by American nuclear bomb testing, where everybody was irradiated, died painful deaths, and the boat was full of tuna. And when they arrived, the tuna was distributed in Japan, and of course it becomes poison, right? It caused such a scare that at that moment there was a housewives petition, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 10 million signatures or something, like the largest petition to ever circulate in Japan. And it's that moment where there starts to be, I believe, a sort of recognition that atomic bombing is different than other kinds of bombing. Because in the immediate aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in some ways it's very similar to the firebombing of other cities, right? Complete annihilation and destruction, but no immediate recognition that this is different somehow. in terms of radiation. But with the Lucky Dragon incident, then there started to become awareness of radiation, fears of radiation, and those fears of radiation manifest as Godzilla. That's how I would read it. So I really do connect it to war trauma. Was that everything? I might have forgotten the second part.
No, it was just about if there is a connection to this, because you're saying these are distinctly, they're global, but they come from Japan and they have these influences.
Mm-hmm.
Godzilla is commonly considered globally a very popular
Yes.
Japanese monster.
Absolutely.
My kind of question was where does that fit?
Right. I mean, certainly the product of a global conflict. I guess the one point I would say that connects it to traditional ideas of Japanese monstrosity is, remember when I was talking about Teito Monogatari, the original demon, right, that becomes this vengeful spirit of Tokyo, and then people pray to him to placate him. He eventually becomes a protector deity in the film. Like, he doesn't want to be woken up. He's like, if I wake up, I will destroy the city. So this is actually common. The three great vengeful demons in Japanese folklore, all of them become protector deities. So originally people pray to them to placate them because they're afraid of destruction, but then they start to pray to them because they protect the local city. This is what happens to Godzilla, right? Godzilla comes and destroys Japan, and then 5 years later, Godzilla is protecting Japan from all kinds of things. I think that pattern is maybe salient, but. Anyway, thank you for your question. Did you have?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, certainly in terms of the etymological play of kaiju, strange beast, there are plenty of strange beasts that would populate all of these adaptations, but there are some particularly large beasts in a lot of manga productions that cross over with Lovecraftian material. And all of a sudden I'm blanking on his name. We went to the museum.
Aramata?
Not Aramata.
Junji Ito.
Yeah, Junji Ito has a story about a giant whale-like creature that washes up on the beast, and there's a bunch of sort of like almost like degenerate humans inside of it. And it turns out they're still all alive inside of its stomach, eternally sort of like writhing there and things like that. That's a fun one. And I believe we also have a contributor that's looking at Gyo by the same author and connecting it up to kaiju manga as well. So there's some connectivity there as well.
Sorry, I know that there are a few more questions, but we are out of time. I'm sure that Drew and Mike would happily answer more questions, but let's thank our panelists.